They wanted me to speak. After 40 years of silence, they wanted me to stand before 300 young officers and explain what happened during the Cradle Wars. The dean of the academy sent 17 formal requests. I refused 16 of them. On the 17th, I agreed, not because I had changed my mind about speaking, but because I had finally accepted that the silence was doing more harm than the truth. My name is Keth Faroon. I am 312 years old. I served as a tactical liaison for the Voskari High Command during the full span of the Cradle Wars, from the first contact skirmish near the Helion Belt to the final ceasefire over Voskar Prime. I have more combat hours logged than anyone else alive in the Union today. I have also spent the last 4 decades trying very hard not to think about most of them. When I walked into that lecture hall and looked out at 300 fresh faces, I saw everything I had once been: confident, well-trained, certain that the universe operated according to rules that could be understood, modeled, and defeated. They were wearing their new rank insignia for the first time. Some of them had polished their medals before coming. I recognized that. I had done the same thing once. I set my notes down on the podium. Then I put them away. Notes were wrong for this. Notes were for lectures about tactics and supply chains and orbital insertion angles. What I had to say did not belong on a page. It belonged in the part of the mind that wakes you at 3 a.m. and will not let you go back to sleep. I told them I was going to describe the humans. 3 of them smiled. One laughed quietly, leaning to whisper something to the officer beside him. I let him laugh. I remembered doing the same thing when I first received the intelligence briefing on the human 14th Expeditionary Force. The Voskari assessment had been thorough. It had also been almost perfectly wrong in every way that mattered. The briefing had described the humans with what I now understand was spectacular confidence. Their ships were smaller than ours. Their weapons had less range. Their average operational lifespan was roughly 70 to 80 years, compared to our 300. They had no precognitive relay network, which meant their battlefield communication was slow, reactive, and dependent on technology that could be jammed. Their biology was fragile: 2 arms, 2 legs, soft tissue covering most of their body, a cardiovascular system that failed under prolonged stress. The briefing called them manageable. I read that word again recently. Manageable. I kept the original document. I have looked at it many times over the years, not because I enjoy the memory, but because I think it is important to understand exactly how wrong a very intelligent civilization can be when it is looking at something it does not yet understand. Our intelligence team had done everything right, by the standards of Voskari military science. They had gathered data. They had measured. They had compared. They had projected outcomes based on every war the Union had ever fought, against every species it had ever encountered. The model was sound. The inputs were accurate. The conclusion was catastrophically incorrect. And the reason it was incorrect is the thing I spent 40 years trying to put into words. On the 3rd day of the Helion Belt engagement, I saw human soldiers for the first time in a live combat feed. Our sensors were picking up their biosigns clearly. I was seated next to our chief medical analyst, a brilliant officer named Teth Moran, who was watching the same feed and narrating what he observed. He said their heart rates are extremely elevated. Respiration is fast and irregular. Muscle tremor is visible in multiple units. Hormonal cascade suggests acute fear response across the entire formation. I asked him what that meant tactically. He said, "It means they are frightened. A frightened force is an unreliable force. We should expect hesitation, poor coordination, possible early withdrawal." We watched them advance. They did not hesitate. They did not withdraw. Every biosign Teth Moran had described, every physical marker of fear that our science told us should produce caution or retreat, was present and clearly readable, and the humans were walking forward anyway, not running, not charging recklessly, walking, steady, in formation, with all of that terror visible in their bodies and apparently invisible to their decision-making. Teth Moran said nothing for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, that he needed to recalibrate his instruments because something was clearly wrong with the readings. Nothing was wrong with the readings. I remember the exact moment I understood this. Though I did not fully understand what I understood, not then. It came to me in pieces over the following weeks, and then in a single sharp instant on a morning I will describe later. But the seed of it was there, in that first feed, watching humans walk toward our defensive line with their hands shaking and their hearts hammering and their faces set in, expressions that our behavioral analysis software classified as distress. Every species the Voskari had ever fought operated on the same fundamental principle. Fear was a signal. Stop, reassess, find another way. It was a survival mechanism. It was in fact the most basic survival mechanism in the known biological universe. Every creature that had ever evolved to live on a dangerous world had developed some version of this circuit. You feel danger. You feel fear. You slow down, you recalculate. This is not a weakness, it is intelligence, it is the body protecting the mind. Humans felt the fear. We could measure it. It was real and present and physiologically identical to every fear response we had ever catalogued in any species. And then they treated it as if it were a minor inconvenience, not as if they did not feel it. That would have been strange but comprehensible. Some species had evolved reduced pain and fear responses, and we knew how to account for that. The humans felt everything. The data was clear. They simply felt it, registered it, and continued forward regardless. I stood in front of those young officers in the academy hall and I told them this. I told them exactly what I had seen on that first day, and I watched their expressions change. The three who had smiled stopped smiling. The one who had laughed was very still. I told them that our first response, as a command, was to dismiss what we were seeing. We told ourselves it was poor discipline. We told ourselves the humans had simply not been trained correctly, that they did not fully understand what they were walking into. That once the reality of engagement became clear, they would respond the way every other species responded. We made these arguments because the alternative, that they understood perfectly and advanced anyway, did not fit into our models. It did not fit into the universe as we had understood it for 3 centuries. I told them, the universe had not changed. Our understanding of it had simply been incomplete. Our strategists went back to their models. They ran the Hillian belt engagement through the simulation 43 times. In 41 of those simulations, the human force retreated before the 3rd hour. In the actual engagement, they had not retreated by the 9th hour. Our commander had to redeploy 2 reserve units to reinforce a position the model had said would not be threatened. Tethmoran filed a new report. In it, he noted that the human fear response appeared to be, in some way he could not yet explain, decoupled from their behavioral response. The body felt danger. The body communicated danger. Something between the body and the decisions, something in that gap, was filtering the signal and sending forward a different instruction. He called it a malfunction. He was wrong. It was the most precise and effective combat adaptation he had ever observed. It had just taken him a while to see it that way. I looked at those young officers in the academy hall, 300 faces, none of them smiling now, and I told them the thing that frames everything else I am about to tell you. Every species we had ever fought either felt no fear, or stopped when they felt it. There was no third option in our model. Fear was either absent or decisive. That was the universe as we knew it. We had verified this across 37 contact events spanning 211 years of Union military history. The humans were the 38th contact event. They felt fear completely, at full biological intensity, in every cell of their bodies, and they treated it as irrelevant. I paused after I said that. I let it sit in the room. Nobody laughed. Good, I thought. Good, because what comes next is worse. The medical logs from the 4th day of the orbital siege of Voskar Prime were reviewed by 6 different Voskari physicians over the course of the war. All 6 filed separate reports. All 6 used some version of the same phrase, continued operating, not as a description of function, as a symptom. They were documenting it as something that needed to be explained, something that sat outside the normal range of biological possibility, something that their training had not prepared them to classify. I have read those reports so many times I could recite them. I keep returning to that phrase, continued operating. What it meant, in plain language, was that the humans were doing things their bodies should not have allowed them to do. Not by any model we had, not by any measure we could apply. I will tell you about Sergeant Owen Garrett. He was 26 years old during the siege. He commanded a fire team of 4 soldiers, 2 men and 2 women, all in their 20s, all trained by the human military system that I had by then begun to study with something close to obsession. His team was assigned to hold a transit corridor in the lower section of the station, while the broader engagement resolved itself around them. The engagement did not resolve itself. The relief column that was supposed to reach them was destroyed in the 4th hour of the first day. Garrett's team was told to hold and wait for a second relief. The second relief never came. By the time command had the situation stabilized enough to send a team to their position, 19 hours had passed. When our forces encountered them, and I want to be precise about this, because I have seen the sensor logs, 3 of the 4 members of Garrett's team were still at their posts, not sheltering, not waiting passively, at their posts, performing active defensive functions with equipment that should have been depleted 8 hours earlier, in physical conditions that our medical team later described as representing the absolute outer boundary of what biological tissue could survive and still produce coordinated action. Garrett himself had sustained 2 significant injuries during those 19 hours. I will not describe them in clinical detail, because the clinical detail is not the point. The point is what Tethmoran said when he reviewed Garrett's scans after extraction. If this were a Voskari soldier, I would be writing a post-event autopsy, not a treatment plan. He was not writing an autopsy. Garrett was conscious during the extraction. He was responsive. He was asking, in the particular human fashion, whether his team had held the corridor. They had held the corridor. Our medical team spent 3 days studying the 4 members of Garrett's fire team. What they found was not a malfunction. It was not poor sensitivity to pain or some unusual genetic variation. What they found was a system, elegant, deeply integrated, and clearly the product of millions of years of evolution on a world that had required exactly this capability to survive. The human body, under extreme stress, releases a sequence of chemical signals. Moran called it a cascade. In a simplified description, the body recognizes a crisis that threatens survival. In that moment, it begins selectively overriding its own safety signals. Pain, which normally functions as a stop signal, a message from damaged tissue that says slow down, protect this area, rest, becomes muted. Not eliminated, muted. The human can still feel that something is wrong, but the volume is turned down far enough that they can continue to function through it. At the same time, energy reserves that the body would normally protect, stores held back for recovery, for healing, for rest, are released directly into the muscles and the cognitive systems. The human becomes, for a period of time, functionally stronger and more alert than they would be under normal conditions, despite being physically damaged. The cascade has a cost. Moran was very clear about this. The cost comes after. The body takes a significant toll. Recovery is long. The damage that was muted rather than addressed has to be paid for later, often in compounded ways. The cascade does not make the human invulnerable. It simply moves the accounting. It defers the consequences to a time when the crisis is over. In combat, the crisis is never fully over. And so the humans could continue running that cascade for durations that our models had never considered possible. That alone would have been remarkable. What made it extraordinary was the second thing Moran found. The humans knew about this system. They had known about it for centuries. They had studied it, named its components, mapped its triggers, and then they had built it into their training. The entire human military conditioning program, as we came to understand it, was structured around 2 goals. The first goal was obvious: make the soldier more physically capable, stronger, faster, more precise. Standard military training. Every species did something similar. The second goal was something we had never seen before. It was to put the soldier close enough to the edge of this chemical cascade, regularly, repeatedly, over years of preparation, that they could enter it at will, not wait for a crisis to trigger it, choose to trigger it. They were not simply hoping that their soldiers would be able to endure extreme conditions. They were manufacturing soldiers who had already been to the edge of their own limits so many times that the edge felt familiar. They had made the extraordinary normal. They had taken the very peak of human biological performance and moved it from the category of emergency response into the category of trained skill. I stood in front of the academy students and I watched a young lieutenant in the front row quietly close. Her notebook. She did not open it again. I understood. There was nothing in her notes about this. There's nothing in any standard military curriculum about this, because until the Cradle Wars, no Union species had encountered anything like it. I told them about the day my commanding officer, a senior strategist named Veth Aralan, received Moran's initial report on the human biology findings. Veth Aralan read it once, then he set it down. Then he said, with the particular brand of confident dismissal that very intelligent people sometimes use when they encounter something that threatens their model of the world, that the humans simply had underdeveloped nervous systems, that their pain response was crude, that this was not an adaptation but a deficiency, that a species with a properly evolved nervous system would never be able to do these things, because a properly evolved nervous system would not permit them. He was a brilliant officer. He had 40 years of decorated service. He had never been wrong about anything significant in the span of his career. He died on the 31st day of the siege. I checked the engagement logs after the ceasefire. Owen Garrett's unit was involved in the action that led to Veth Aralan's death. I do not know if Garrett personally was present. I know his team was. I know that the action occurred in the precise location where our intelligence had assessed there was no meaningful threat remaining. The intelligence assessment was based on models that did not account for what Garrett's team could do. I went back to Moran's report and read it again after Veth Aralan died. I read the line about the cascade, about the deferred accounting, about the cost that comes after. I thought about what kind of species builds a civilization on that principle. Pay the cost later. Endure now. Keep going. The consequences are a problem for the version of you that survives this moment. I thought about what kind of world produces that as an evolutionary strategy, not just in individual bodies, but in the culture, in the training, in the deliberate choices made by the military structure. They had looked at this capability in their own biology and said, more. They had taken the most extreme thing their bodies could do and practiced it until it was ordinary. I thought about that young lieutenant closing her notebook in the front row. I thought, she is just beginning to understand. And what she is beginning to understand is going to follow her for the rest of her career. I told the students what Teth Moran told me, privately. Late in the third month of the siege, he was tired. Even for a Voskari, he was tired. He had been reviewing human physiology data for 90 days, and it had changed something in him that was visible if you knew how to look. He said, Keth, I have spent my entire career believing that the limit of biological performance is fixed, that there is a ceiling, and every species operates somewhere beneath it. The humans do not operate beneath the ceiling, they operate at it, and then they push. He paused. Then he said, I do not think they know there is a ceiling. I have told that story to every junior officer who has ever been assigned under my command. Not as a warning about the humans as enemies. The war ended long ago and they are not our enemies now. I tell it because of what it means about the nature of limits. About the difference between a limit that is real and a limit that is simply the edge of what you have so far decided to do. Teth Moran retired after the war. He spent the rest of his career studying human physiology. His published work is used in every Union medical school today. He dedicated it, and I always stop on this line when I read it, to the soldiers of the 14th Expeditionary, who demonstrated that the ceiling is a suggestion. Owen Garrett, I later learned, was extracted from the station, treated over several months, and returned to active service. He served for another 9 years before leaving the military. He lived to be 74 years old, which is a long human life. He had a family. Became a teacher. I read his obituary when it was published, fed to me through one of the Union's cross-species information networks. It listed his decorations, it listed the siege, it described him, in the careful human way, as someone who had given everything for his unit and asked for nothing in return. It did not mention the ceiling. It did not need to. 6 months into the war, I was reassigned to the Strategic Planning Division. My role was liaison. I was supposed to help translate field intelligence into usable inputs for the command models. This sounds precise and organized, which it was, until the models stopped working. Let me be exact about what I mean. The Voskari strategic modeling system was not a simple calculation. It was the product of 2 centuries of refinement. It had been used to plan 73 major military operations. Its accuracy rating across those operations was 91% within a 4% margin of error. Generals had retired with full honors after careers built entirely around managing its outputs. Entire curriculum sections at the academy were dedicated to its use. It was, by any reasonable measure, the finest predictive military intelligence tool in the known galaxy. Against the humans, it was wrong 47 times in a row. Not slightly wrong. Not wrong by a small margin that could be corrected with better input data. Wrong in ways that required completely rebuilding the assumptions the model was built on. We would run a simulation and the model would say, human force retreats by hour 6. We would watch the engagement and the humans would be attacking by hour 6. We would rerun the simulation with corrected data and the model would say, human force consolidates, digs in, waits for relief. The humans would be attacking again. The model would say, human force, having sustained these casualties, is no longer combat effective. The humans would not have received that message. The head of strategic planning was a senior commander named Vel Saroth. She was the kind of officer who had made her career by being right. She had an instinct for synthesis, for taking scattered data and finding the single thread that unified it. She was one of the best minds I encountered in 40 years of service, and watching the human engagement data come in, week after week, was changing her in ways that were difficult to watch. In the 7th week, she called a full review. Every senior analyst, every model architect, every liaison officer, she put the full record on the table. 47 engagement simulations, 47 incorrect predictions, and she asked a single question. She said, "What are we getting wrong?" The room had answers. They had many answers. Better sensor data, improved casualty thresholds, more accurate modeling of human supply line degradation, more precise weightings for human communication delays. All of these answers had one thing in common. They were technical. They were about improving the inputs. They assumed that the model structure was correct, and that the errors were a data quality problem. I listened to this for 2 hours. Then I said something that made the room go quiet, in a way that told me I had touched something nobody wanted to. Touch, I said. I do not think the model is broken. I think we are modeling the wrong variable. Velsaroth looked at me. She asked me to explain. I said, every model we have is built on the assumption that morale degrades with adversity. That a force which takes heavy casualties, loses leadership, suffers supply disruption, and operates beyond its planned engagement window will become progressively less capable. That these factors compound. That there is a curve, and every force follows it downward when the pressure is sufficient. I said, the humans do not follow the curve. There was silence. One of the model architects said, carefully, that every species followed the curve. It was not a doctrine. It was an empirical observation drawn from the full record of Union military history. 200 years of data. 37 contact events. Every force under sufficient sustained pressure degraded. The rate varied. The threshold varied. But the direction was always the same. I said yes, and the humans are the 38th contact event, and they do not follow the curve. I told them about the Battle of Kethsorth Station. The station was a secondary logistics node, not strategically critical, not worth a major engagement. It was the kind of position that, in any normal campaign, would have been abandoned when the tactical situation made holding it too costly. The humans had 1 battalion there, roughly 800 soldiers, under the command of a major named Colin Farrow. He was 31 years old. He had been on active deployment for 2 years without rotation. On the 6th day of the battle for the station, Farrow was wounded in an exchange that destroyed his forward command post and eliminated most of his staff. His unit had taken substantial casualties by that point. Their resupply line had been cut for 4 days. Our intelligence assessment, reviewed later, had given them a 2% survival probability and placed their offensive capability at functionally 0. On the 7th day, Farrow's battalion launched an offensive, not a desperate push, not a last-act charge born of panic, a coordinated, multi-vector offensive that neutralized 3 of our defensive positions in under 4 hours and created an opening that allowed a secondary human force to reinforce the station. Farrow directed it from a position that put him at considerable personal risk throughout. He had no operational justification for the move. By every rational calculation, his unit should have been sheltering, conserving what remained, waiting to be relieved or to be overrun. He attacked instead. When I described this in the planning review, Vel Saroth asked me a question. She asked, what was his stated reason? Did he leave any record of the decision? I told her yes. There was a brief voice log recovered afterward. It was not a formal command record. It was informal, clipped, the way humans spoke when they did not think anyone was archiving them. He said something that I wrote down and have kept with me since. He said, they're expecting us to be done. Let's not be done. The planning room was very quiet. Vel Saroth sat with that for a long time. Then she asked me what I thought it meant. I told her what I had been piecing together for 6 months of watching human behavior in engagement after engagement. I told her that the humans had a relationship with adversity that we did not have a name for in Voskari military language. We had a concept for endurance, for the ability to sustain effort over time. We had a concept for courage, for the choice to act despite risk. But what the humans were displaying was neither of those things. Or rather, it was both of them combined with something else. What they had was a relationship with the idea of being beaten. For the Voskari, for every Union species I had encountered, the experience of being in a losing position activated a withdrawal response. Not cowardice, this is important to understand. A withdrawal response is rational. When the odds are against you, you protect what remains. You preserve your force for future engagement. You accept the local loss to preserve the overall capability. This is intelligent. This is how wars are won by forces that cannot afford to spend themselves fighting battles they cannot win. The humans looked at a losing position and became more dangerous. I do not mean this as a metaphor. I mean it in a direct and measurable sense. The engagement data, reviewed across the full record of the first 6 months, showed a consistent and extraordinary pattern. Human forces that were under the highest pressure, the most casualties, the worst supply situations, the greatest command disruption, were producing outcomes at the upper range of their capability envelope, not the bottom. The top. The forces that were suffering the most were fighting the hardest. Vel Saroth said, that is impossible. I said, I agree. And yet, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I have never forgotten, and I have shared it in every conversation about the Cradle Wars that I have had since. She said, we have been treating their desperation as a weakness. It is the opposite. We spent the next 4 hours rebuilding the model. Or trying to. The problem was that we could not find a way to quantify what we were describing. How do you assign a numerical value to the will to continue? How do you model a variable that moves in the wrong direction when adversity increases? Our entire predictive framework was built on the assumption that rational actors under pressure would make rational choices, and by rational, we meant choices that minimized risk and preserved capability. The humans were making choices that, by our definition, were irrational, and those choices were winning. One of the younger analysts raised a point that I want to give him credit for, because it was the right point at the right time. He said, what if the irrationality is the strategy? We looked at him, he said, what if it is not a malfunction in their decision-making? What if they have learned, culturally, at the deepest level, that appearing beaten triggers something in their psychology that enhances performance? What if the adversity is not something they endure? What if it is something they use? The room was silent for a long time. I thought about the thousands of years of human history I had studied in the briefing archives. The wars they had fought against each other, and they had fought extraordinary numbers of wars against each other, across thousands of years, on a single world, with no external enemy to unite against. I thought about what kind of psychology that history would produce. What kind of person would survive in a world where the threats were constant, where defeat was always possible, where the only ones who passed their traits to the next generation were the ones who found a way to keep going? You would get exactly this. You would get a species that had internalized the experience of near defeat so thoroughly that it had become a trigger rather than a termination. You would get a species that had practiced surviving desperate situations so many times, in war, in disease, in scarcity, in every kind of crisis a world can produce, that the desperate situation felt like home ground. I told the planning room, you cannot model an enemy whose primary combat intensifier is the belief that they might lose. We could not rebuild the model that day. We never fully rebuilt it. We made adjustments, improved the predictions somewhat, narrowed the error margins. But the fundamental problem remained, because the fundamental problem was not in the data, it was in the architecture. We had built a model for rational actors. We were fighting people whose rationality operated on premises we did not share and could not replicate. Velsaroth took the new findings to high command. I was with her. She presented everything, the morale data, the Keth-Sorath analysis, the cascade biology Colin Farrow's voice log. She was clear and careful and precise. She told them exactly what I have told you now. The response from high command was not what either of us had hoped for. There was acknowledgement. There was discussion. There was a decision to increase resource allocation to the modeling division and to commission a new long-range study on human psychology. There was no change in strategy. I remember the walk back from that meeting. Velsaroth and I were in a corridor, alone, moving through the silence of a command station late in its operational day. She stopped walking. She stood in the middle of that corridor for a long moment. Then she said quietly, without looking at me, "We are going to lose this war." She did not say it with bitterness or with fear. She said it the way you say something that has moved, in your mind, from the category of possibility into the category of fact. Flat, simple, already processed. I asked her when she had decided. She said, "The day Pharaoh attacked with 2% survival probability." I did not let myself know it until today. We stood there in the corridor. Around us, the war continued. Projections were being updated. Simulations were being run. Officers who had not been to the planning meeting were working from models that could not capture what we had just seen. I thought about Pharaoh. I thought about Garrett. I thought about 300 humans walking toward our defensive line, with their hands shaking and their hearts pounding, and their expressions classified as distress, moving forward anyway. I thought about what Velsaroth had said, and I knew she was right, and I understood that knowing she was right and being able to do something about it were two entirely different things. The study on human psychology was commissioned. It took 8 months to complete. It confirmed everything we had already found. It was filed. The war continued for another 2 years. On the day the ceasefire was signed, Velsaroth sent me a single written message. No greeting, no signature, just 4 words. Pharaoh was not done. She was right about that too. The garrison at Meshtor had been considered secure for 6 weeks before we moved through it. The battle for the station had ended. Our forces had pushed through, secured the position, and left behind a skeleton presence. The humans had been driven back to their secondary line. By any operational measure, Meshtor was a resolved situation. I was there with a small intelligence team, recovering documents and data systems before the broader force moved on. Routine work, the kind of assignment you give to experienced people who are too valuable for the front but too senior to leave idle. We had been in the station for 4 hours when one of the junior officers on my team, a young analyst named Ren Hollis, found him. She came to find me in what had been the station's command room. She was not agitated. She was too well trained for that. But there was something in her expression that I had learned, over years of reading faces both Voskari and otherwise, to recognize as the look of someone who had seen something they needed to show another person before they decided what it meant. She said, "There is a human soldier in Section 14. He is alive." I said nothing for a moment. Section 14 was deep in the station's interior, far from any fighting position, far from any route that would have made tactical sense for a human unit in retreat. I asked her if she was certain. She said, "I spoke to him." She led me through 3 corridors and 2 security doors into a part of the station that smelled of recycled air and old systems running on reserve power. The lights were on, low, amber maintenance level, and they made everything look slightly warm, slightly tired. He was sitting on the floor with his back against a wall, beside a door that opened onto a long access corridor. He had clearly arranged himself there deliberately. The position gave him a view of both approaches. Even now, in the condition he was in, he had chosen the tactically correct seat. I will tell you about his condition without dwelling on the clinical details, because the details are not the point. He had been injured. He had been in that station, alone for 11 days. He had food and water for approximately 3 of those days, which told me something about how the remaining 8 had gone. He was alive because he had made very careful, very methodical decisions about how to use what he had, rationing with a precision that suggested a mind still fully engaged with the problem of survival. He looked up when we came in. He was not afraid. I want to be clear about that. A wounded human soldier, alone for 11 days, outnumbered by members of the species he had been fighting. And he looked up at us with eyes that were tired but not frightened. He had already assessed the situation. He had already decided how he felt about it. Fear was not the output of that assessment. His name was Corporal Dae Jung Park. He was 23 years old. He had been separated from his unit during the retreat and had chosen, rather than attempting to follow them, to hold the access corridor he had been assigned to on the final day of the engagement. His unit was gone. His assignment was gone. The tactical justification for the position had ceased to exist 11 days ago. He was holding it anyway. I sat down across from him. I had a translation device. The Union had developed workable human language interfaces early in the conflict for exactly these kinds of situations. I turned it on. I told him who I was. I told him the station was under Voskari control. I told him his unit had retreated to the secondary line. He received all of this information. He processed it. Then he asked me how the broader engagement was going. I told him I was not going to discuss that with him. He nodded, as if this were a completely reasonable answer. Then he asked if his corridor had been secured. I looked at him. I looked at the access corridor behind the door he had been sitting beside for 11 days. I asked him what he meant. He said, "My corridor, the one I was holding. Did it end up mattering? Did our side hold the line past it, or did we lose ground further up?" I told him we had pushed his unit back across the full section. He took that in. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So I was holding a door that didn't matter in the end." I said, "Correct." He thought about this. Then he said, "But someone had to." I did not understand the phrase. I understood the words individually. Together, in this context, they did not parse for me. I told him I did not understand. He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that I have spent 40 years trying to describe, and the best I have managed is this. It was patient, like a person who has explained something many times and is prepared to explain it again without frustration, because the thing being explained is worth explaining, he said. In a battle, you don't always know which positions are going to be the ones that matter. You just know which one you're standing at. So you hold the one you're standing at. You don't hold it because you've calculated that it's the critical point. You hold it because someone has to, and you're the someone who's there. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Your unit is gone. You knew the station had been taken. You had no communication with your command structure. There was no one to report to. There was no one who would have known whether you held the position or not. By any rational measure, the obligation ended when the operational structure ceased to exist," he said. "The obligation is to the door, not to the chain of command. I have been a student of military philosophy for 300 years. I have read the doctrines of 37 species. I have studied the strategic writings of generals whose reputations outlasted their civilizations. I had never heard anyone say anything like that. I had never heard an obligation described that way, not to an authority, not to an outcome, not to a calculation of what was worth doing. To the door. To the physical fact of the thing you had been asked to protect." I asked him how long he had known the station was lost. He said, "About 9 days. I asked him why he stayed. He said, "Because I hadn't been relieved." I asked him who he expected to relieve him. He thought about this for a long moment. Then he said, "I stopped expecting. I just kept holding. I called for a medical team. They came within the hour. The best we had available. With proper equipment and proper understanding of human physiology. They moved him onto a transport stretcher. He cooperated. He was calm throughout. Before they took him, he asked me something. He asked, not urgently, not desperately, in the quiet, careful way of someone who has been alone for a very long time and has learned how to ask for things without demanding them, if the line had held. Not his corridor specifically, the human line. Had they held it somewhere? I looked at him. I thought about what the intelligence team had found in the data systems. The retreating human force had indeed consolidated at a secondary position and held it. That much was true. I could have given him a qualified version of events. I could have said something technically accurate but contextually incomplete. I told him, yes, The line held. This was the only lie I have told in 312 years. I want you to understand that. Not a white lie told for comfort. A deliberate choice. I made it in the space between one breath and the next, and I have never regretted it and never fully forgiven myself for it, and I do not think I am supposed to do either. His expression did not change dramatically. He did not smile with relief or exhale with visible release. He simply looked at me and said, "Good." The way you say good when something has confirmed what you already believed, rather than surprised you. They took him away. I sat in that section of the station for a long time after he was gone. The amber maintenance lights hummed. The recycled air moved through the vents. The door to the access corridor stood open beside me. Just a door, leading to a hallway that connected to nothing important, that had not mattered to the outcome of the battle, that a 23-year-old human had spent 11 days protecting because someone had to, and he was the someone who was there. I filed my report that night, not the intelligence report. That was routine, filed separately. I am talking about the report I wrote for myself, the one that was not for the archive or the command structure or any review process. The one I wrote because I needed to find the words. I wrote, "We are not fighting soldiers who have chosen a dangerous profession. We are fighting a species that has built its entire identity around a single foundational act, the act of not giving up. It is not something they do in extreme circumstances. It is something they are. It is woven into the stories they tell each other, the histories they preserve, the way they raise their young, the names they give to what they consider admirable. They have, across the full span of their civilization, celebrated and selected for, and passed down the quality of continuing when continuation is no longer rational." I wrote, "You cannot win a war against this. You can only refuse to fight it." I wrote, "We have been trying to break something that does not break in the way we understand breaking. It bends, it absorbs, it compresses under pressure, and then releases in the direction you did not prepare for. Every time we have thought we had reduced it to a point where it could no longer function, it has found a different form and continued." I wrote, "Corporal Park was holding a door that didn't matter, alone for 11 days, after being told nothing, with no rational expectation of relief or recognition, and he asked me if the line held before he asked me anything about himself." I wrote, "That is the truth about humans in combat, not the biology, not the cascade, not the morale curve, this." A 23-year-old with 8 days of nothing in his eyes, asking first about the line, asking first whether the thing that mattered had been protected. I sent a copy of that report to Velsaroth. I sent a copy to Teth Morin. I kept a copy. The three of us were the only ones who read it at the time. 14 months later, our High Command presented its recommendation to the Voskari Ruling Council. The recommendation was for ceasefire negotiations. The formal strategic rationale cited resource depletion and extended engagement risk. Those were real factors. They were not the real reason. The real reason was in that report. The real reason was in Velsaroth's corridor moment, and Teth Moran's ceiling observation and Pharaoh's voice log, and 47 model failures and a door in Section 14 that a young man held for 11 days because someone had to. We had finally, fully understood what we were fighting. And in understanding it, we had understood that we could not outlast it. Park was treated on a Union medical transport. He was returned to his unit within 3 months. I followed his service record for the rest of the war, through the channels available to me. He served until the ceasefire. He returned home. He received his decorations in a ceremony that, by the human custom, involved the people who had served beside him standing nearby and watching. I think about that ceremony sometimes. I think about what it means that they mark their survivors that way. Not alone, not in private, but surrounded by the ones who had been there. Even the recognition is not individual. Even the ending of the story involves everyone who was present for the middle of it. That seems right to me. It seems exactly right. I looked out at the 300 officers in the academy hall, and I understood, from the quality of the silence, that they had arrived somewhere different from where they had started. They had come in confident. They had come in certain that the universe was comprehensible, that war was a system with rules, that the unknown was only a gap in the known. I had asked them to follow me through 4 decades of accumulated reckoning, and they had followed, and now they were sitting with the weight of it. The young lieutenant in the front row who had closed her notebook had not opened it again. The officer who had laughed at the beginning of my talk was looking at his hands. Several of the students in the upper tiers were very still, the kind of stillness that indicates a mind fully occupied with what it has just received. I said, "You are going to spend the rest of this day wondering what the lesson is. You are going to look for the tactical takeaway, the strategic implication, the practical guidance. This is reasonable. You are officers. You are trained to extract actionable intelligence from everything you encounter. I am telling you, as someone who spent 40 years doing exactly that, That there is a limit to what that process can give you here. I said, the thing I have described to you today is not a vulnerability. It is not a weakness with an exploit. The humans are our allies now, and have been for 30 years, and the relationship works, and I am glad of it. But I want you to understand what that relationship is built on. It is not built on the humans becoming less of what they were. They did not become more manageable after the war. They became known. There is a difference. I told them about the ceasefire signing. It was held on a neutral station, Union territory, no strategic significance, chosen specifically because it was neither Voskari nor human ground. The delegation that came to the table was on our side, composed of senior officers and diplomatic staff. On the human side, the delegation included their senior military commanders, their diplomatic corps, and this was the detail that I noticed, that I found I could not stop noticing, several junior officers who had served in the war, not as decoration. They were present at the table. Pharaoh was there. His rank was different by then, he had risen, but he was there. I was there as liaison. I was watching both sides of the table. When the final terms were ratified and the signing took place, the Voskari delegation was composed and formal. This was correct. This was what the moment required. We had done what the moment required. The human delegation wept. Not all of them, not publicly, not openly, not in the human way I had come to understand as displays meant to be seen. These were private tears. Individuals sitting very still, with something moving in their faces that the behavioral analysis software would have classified as grief. Not relief, not joy, grief. I asked the human liaison officer sitting beside me, a woman named Karen Lowe, who had been a primary communication contact throughout the ceasefire negotiations, and who was one of the more thoughtful people I had met on either side of the conflict. I asked her quietly what they were feeling. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They are thinking about the ones who did not get to be here." I looked back at the table. The ratification was still proceeding. Signatures were being added. The document that would end the Cradle Wars was being completed, and the human officers who had survived it were sitting there and thinking about the ones who had not. Not after, not later, in private, at a memorial. At the moment of victory, at the exact moment when the fighting was over and the surviving could begin, they were carrying the weight of the dead beside them like a second presence in the room. I thought about that for a long time. I still think about it. What I eventually understood, what I eventually found the words for, many years later, when enough distance had accumulated, is that this is the same thing that Corporal Park had shown me in Section 14. It is the same mechanism, expressed differently. Park held the door because someone had to, not because of personal glory or rational calculation, but because the obligation was real, and he was the person present to fulfill it. The officers at the ceasefire table wept for the dead because those people were still present, still real, still part of the story that was concluding. The connection did not end when the person was gone. The obligation did not end when the mission ended. The relationship did not end when the war ended. The humans carry everything with them. They carry the dead into the room where peace is made. They carry the memory of the 11-day door into the rest of their lives. They carry the cascade's cost in their bodies and pay it later in the long work of recovery. They carry grief as standard equipment, not as damage, not as disruption, as part of what it means to be them. I told the students, the real lesson is not about human physiology. It is not about their morale curves or their cascade chemistry, or their inabilities to accept a losing position. Those are symptoms. They are interesting. They are useful to know, but they are not the thing. The thing is this: at some point, deep in the history of the human world, on that single crowded, violent, beautiful planet, during the long, difficult centuries of their development, they made a choice, not consciously, not as a policy decision, not as a philosophical position taken by an individual thinker. They made it collectively, slowly, across generations, in the way that a species makes choices, by selecting for the survivors and passing down what surviving required. They chose to mean something to each other, not abstractly, not theologically, in the immediate personal material sense. The person beside you means something. The person who held the position before you means something. The person who will hold it after you means something. The obligation runs not just forward to the mission, and not just upward to the command structure. It runs sideways, to every person who is present with you, and backward, to every person who was present before you, and it does not stop running when those people are gone. That is why they cannot be modeled. That is why the morale curve does not apply. That is why Velseroth was right in that corridor, not because the humans were stronger or faster or better supplied, but because they were connected to each other in a way that persisted through everything we did to disrupt it. You cannot disrupt a connection by increasing adversity. The humans had proven this, empirically, across the full length of the Cradle Wars. Adversity did not reduce the connection. Adversity intensified it. Every loss made the remaining ones more important. Every death made the living more determined. We had been treating their grief as a vulnerability, a source of irrational behavior that destabilized their decision-making. We had been completely wrong. Their grief was the source of their cohesion. It was the proof that the connections were real. I said, I want to tell you something about Park, about what happened after. He survived. I mentioned that earlier. He was treated, he recovered. He served until the ceasefire, he went home. He received his decorations. He had a life. By the time he passed 71 years old, which is a long human life well lived by their measure, he had a family, had worked in education for 30 years, had apparently been, by the accounts I found, the kind of person who was very patient with young people who were having a hard time. He had been, by every account, profoundly ordinary in the best possible sense of that phrase. I read his obituary when it was published. It listed his service. It listed the siege. It listed his decorations. It did not mention Section 14. It did not mention the 11 days. It did not mention the door he held for no strategic reason, alone, with no expectation of recognition, because someone had to and he was the someone who was there. He would not have wanted it mentioned. I am certain of this without having been told. He was not holding the door for the story. He was holding the door because the door needed to be held. There is something I did not tell the students in the Academy Hall that day. There is something I have not told anyone, because it is personal in a way that does not fit naturally into a lecture, and because I was not certain until recently that I understood it well enough to say it accurately. When I told Park that the line had held, when I told him the one lie of my life, I did not do it to comfort him. I told myself that was why. I told myself it was a kindness, a small mercy to a person in pain. That is true as far as it goes, but the reason I have sat with for 40 years is this. He deserved for the line to have held. Not in a military sense, not in a strategic sense, in the sense that what he had done, those 11 days, that door, that singular, uncomplicated commitment to a thing that had long since ceased to matter to anyone but him, was the kind of thing that should be rewarded by the universe. It should be repaid. A person who holds a door for 11 days because someone has to should be told at the end that the door mattered. It did not matter. The line did not hold in the way I implied. The corridor was irrelevant. The outcome was unaffected, and yet, the lie was not about the corridor. The lie was about the fact that someone had noticed that somewhere in the universe, an old alien officer was sitting on the floor of a captured station thinking, this person did something that matters, and it matters precisely because no one required it of him, and no one would ever have known if he had simply stopped. I notice. That is what the lie said in the only language available to me at that moment. I see what you did, and I see why, and the universe is not so indifferent as it sometimes appears. I am 312 years old. I have seen 37 species fight and negotiate and grieve and rebuild. I have watched civilizations make decisions and live with them across centuries. I have never, in all of that time, encountered anything that affected me the way that conversation in Section 14 affected me. Not a battle, not a great speech, not a historic moment of any kind. A young man on a floor, a door behind him, 11 days of holding something that didn't matter and asking, at the end, whether the line held. I stood at the podium in the Academy Hall, and I looked at 300 young officers who were going to go out into the galaxy and do whatever the galaxy asked of them. I looked at their clean insignia and their careful posture and their faces that were, at this moment, very serious and very still. I told them the humans are your allies. Treat them accordingly, not because it is politically correct, not because the treaty requires it, because they are the kind of allies who will hold the door for 11 days after the operational justification is gone. And if you are ever in the position of needing someone to hold a door that no longer matters, strategically, rationally, by any calculation available to any model, you want that to be a debt you have not created and do not owe. I told them, but more than that, pay attention to what they show you about what it means to be present for each other. They have something we have been slower to develop, not a biological advantage, a cultural one. They learned the hard way on a very difficult world that the person beside you is the most important variable in any equation, not the equipment, not the supply line, not the strategic position. The person beside you. I gathered my notes which I had not used. The hall was quiet. It had been quiet for some time. I looked at the young officer who had laughed at the beginning of my talk. He was looking at me. He was not laughing. He had the expression of someone who has been given information they did not ask for and cannot give back. I said, I know this was not the lecture you expected. I know you came here for tactics and doctrine and the kind of clear, applicable knowledge that earns you marks on your assessments. I am sorry that I do not have that for you today. What I have is this. 4 decades of watching human beings refuse to be done. 47 failed models, 1 LIDAR, I said. Corporal Park passed away at the age of 71. The medical report, which I was able to access through Union records, because I had followed his life from a distance for 50 years. As you follow the lives of the people who have changed how you see the world, medical report noted that his heart had given out. The cascade chemistry takes its toll. The deferred accounting paid at last. It noted, in the clinical language of medical documentation, that he had been a difficult patient throughout his earlier treatment, that he had resisted sedation on multiple occasions, that he had repeatedly been found attempting to move before he was cleared to do so, that his doctors had described him, in the notes, as someone who treated his own recovery as an obstacle rather than a process. It noted that he had lived another 48 years after the war. I said, I believed it. I never believed anything more completely in my life. I thanked them for their time and stepped away from the podium. The hall was silent for a long moment. Then, from somewhere in the upper tiers, one of the students began to applaud. Not the formal measured applause of an academy event, the other kind, the kind that comes from somewhere that is not entirely professional. I walked out before it finished. I am old enough to know the difference between a performance and a reckoning, and I did not want them to give me the former when what they had just experienced was the latter. Outside, in the corridor, I stood for a moment in the quiet. I thought about Park on his floor. I thought about the door. I thought, somewhere in the galaxy right now, a human is in a situation that everyone else has assessed as finished, and they have not yet received the message that says they are supposed to stop. And they are not going to stop, I thought. Good, I thought, good.